Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Tiny Bones Bauble Burglar. This is a $50 budget deck that comes to us from Kermit the Frog. Kermit says, I might have too much discard and not enough ways to stop opponents from killing me when they gang up on me. This is pretty simple direction for a lot of decks, but of course, we have to make sure we can fit within that $50 budget. For me, if you're looking at the screen right now, you might notice that I have turned on the prices of the cards, and that's probably something we'll get into about budget building in a moment after we look at the commander, but I love budget deck building. I think $50 to $100 budget commander decks are really, really good. 100 I think is reasonable if you want to build something that's, still capable of doing what is common for that deck and having some, really fun splashy effects. But $50 for a commander deck, which is, I believe nowadays, cheaper than a pre-made, pre-constructed commander deck, depending where you live. But $50, I think that's like a great sweet spot where you get to see a lot of really fun cards you don't usually see. And honestly, I think that solves a lot of these conversations we're having about power level and things like that, is instead have everyone build a $50 commander deck and see how it goes, see what works, see what doesn't. And I think you'll have a good time, because worst case scenario, if it doesn't work out, it's just $50. And I do understand for some newer Magic players, that's a crazy thing to say. But when I'm looking to upgrade my modern deck and I need to spend, I need to buy 4 Ketramos and each of them is more than $50. A $50 deck is a very big budget. Thank you so much, Kermit, for supporting the channel. Let's take a look at the commander and get right into it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Tiny Bones Bauble Burglar, and why are they our mono black discard commander for our budget deck? Tiny Bones is a legendary skeleton rogue, a creature I really, really like and I think is very, very funny. 2 mana for a 1/3 with 3 abilities. The first one is whenever an opponent discards a card, exile it from their graveyard with a stash counter on it. The second one that says during your turn, you may play cards you don't own with stash counters on them from exile, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. And finally, for 3 and a black, tap Tiny Bones. Each opponent discards a card, activate only as a sorcery. So let's go through the idea of Tiny Bones. Tiny Bones is one of those steal your opponent card style enablers where when your opponents discard cards, they go into a stash, and from that stash you can cast them using any color. What's important about this is even if Tiny Bones change zones, as long as Tiny Bones comes back, so past removal, past counter magic, past exile, as long as Tiny Bones comes back, you still get access to that entire stash of things he's stolen, so you always have access to those cards, which is really, really cool. And what's important to note is that you can only play them during your turn, so certain cards become less useful, namely counter magic. Don't get me wrong, you can still use them as someone tries to interact on your turn, but I would say most smart opponents will not do that or try to avoid that by casting removal on your creatures or your cards on their turn, so you can't cast the counter magic from the stash. But things like removal, things like combat tricks, those are still going to be really, really good, because it doesn't say at instant, it has to be at sorcery speed, it says during your turn, so you do have a lot of leeway there. On the other hand, speaking of sorcery speed, that last ability, 3 and a black, tap, each opponent discards a card, can only be activated as a sorcery, which is kind of tricky, not ideal, but this is a ability you're supposed to use when you've got nothing else to do with the mana. It's a mana sink, right? It's not like you're really attacking with Tiny Bones anyways, so having access to this at any time is really, really good. This also will stop you from playing certain cards, I would say, like a Nerve. I'm pretty sure Unnerve is the one I'm thinking of. That is just 3 and a black sorcery. Each opponent discards a card. Well, now you don't need to play those cards because it's just attached to your commander. This also applies to an extent to cards like Scepter of Fugue, or Fugue. I think it's Scepter of Fugue, or Fugue Scepter. Now you got me unsure, but Same text, 3 and a black, tap this, each opponent discards a card kind of thing, because now you just have it attached to your commander, which is rather good. Not that those cards are particularly expensive, but it's still worth considering. Now, speaking of expensive, let's talk about the concept of a budget and a budget commander deck. Now, when we have this deck out, I can see on Card Kingdom, this is going for $94. Is that accurate? That might be the first thing we might have to talk about whenever we look at budget decks. My answer would probably be no. I don't think it would be. Mainly because I find Card Kingdom is not necessarily the cheapest you can get things, and that's not including, trading things or, other ways you can get a card that might reduce its price, as in getting it in like a pack or something like that, or you might be just considered free. But when we're budgeting, we have to make sure all of our players are budgeting in the same way. So for the argument here, I'm going to assume that this $94 is $50, and I'm still going to try to reduce prices here and there, and we're going to overall try to reduce the cost of the deck when we can, but know that the leeway in the end will be on the deck builder. For example, you might consider that like shipping, does that count? I know it's a silly thing to think about, but I live in Canada, so my prices might not be the same as yours. So we might be asking, is it $50 US, $50 Canadian, not even including, other currencies around the world. So just make sure you have the same idea. And for the purpose of this video, we're gonna kind of play with it because all we have is this Card Kingdom cost. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm not gonna go through TCG Player or all that for every single card. So, though usually we're going to, and we still are, we're going to still start with looking at lands and looking at curve. After that, before we look too far at individual cards or types of cards, we're going to look at the highest cards in the budget and then try to decide whether or not they are worth it. So let's start there. We are at 33 lands with 34 with MDFCs. As many know, that's a bit low for me. I really wouldn't mind us going up 3 lands. 3 extra swamps isn't expensive. Speaking of expensive, according to this, 29 swamps is $10. Is that correct? I'm pretty sure swamps just don't cost anything if you go to a store, right? You can just get them from drafts. I would count them as 0, but I'm not going to get into that. But here we can see $10 worth of swamps for 29 swamps. We could play three more, play 36 cards, 36 lands, 37 including MDFC, and I would be a little happier. Granted, we don't really have a lot of high mana costs, but I would say cards like Sir Conrad, Grey Merchant, and Painful Quandary are absolutely worth playing and very, very strong, and I would really like to ensure we can cast them, so having a few extra lands is nice. I'm even going to suggest, I think, at least one card that's more, at least 2 cards I think that are more expensive. So with that in mind, I still would like us to get to at least 36 lands, 37 with MDFC to be comfortable. After which we look at the curve. I think the curve looks great, especially for a budget deck. I think this is really, really normal, and though there's probably a few extra cards we could go over 5 mana, and some I will suggest, I think this is pretty nice. 3 is our highest one. I think I would prefer for 2 mana to be our highest one, but with our commander at 2 mana, I think this is particularly fine, and we're not in too bad of a place. Overall, structurally, really do like the deck. So let's look at the most expensive cards of the deck. And I'm pretty sure I can just hit sort price. I'm hoping it will let me do that. Yeah, it will. Okay, so let's look at the most expensive cards in each lane. Creatures are pretty nice. Grey Merchant being at $2 I think is fair. Grey Merchant is such a strong card that I don't mind paying extra for it. Actually, let's pause and say one more thing about budgeting for a budget deck. The idea is, if each card is 1%, you want each card individually to be worth about 1% of the value, right? 100 cards at $50 is what, 150-cent cards? Yeah, that maths out. And so if the bar is 50 cents, you can just easily build this deck and say every card is 50 cents. But we know that not every card is 50 cents. We can see even here, a few of these are 35 cents, which is still probably higher than you could get them in real. Like Burglar Rat, I can't imagine you'd have to pay more than a quarter for, but still, With this being lower than the 50-cent mark, it allows us to build a bit of a stockpile to spend on better cards. So, as I was saying before, one of those better cards is Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which I do agree with. Another one, however, is Abyssal Harvester, and this is a tougher one for me. I recently saw this in play for the first time, and I'm going to be honest, I wasn't too impressed with it. Like, don't get me wrong, it can be strong, and it has some interesting synergies with, for example, these Burglar Rat type cards, where you block with it, you let it die, and then you reanimate it with Abyssal Harvester, and that's neat. But I don't think that's particularly doing anything that like Undying Evil or another Undying effect couldn't do anyways. So really, the way we want to use this is to get key cards, namely our opponent's cards, because no offense to this deck, our creatures are not the strongest. There's some cute things we can do where we can like, another one would be like casting one of these Plague Crafter style cards where we summon the creature, sacrifice the creature, our opponent sacrifice the creature, and then Abyssal Harvester reanimates that creature, it comes in, sacrifices itself, same thing happens again. That is really neat, but that's super specific, and I think I'd rather just a generic valuable card that we can rely on, whereas Abyssal Harvester needs some things to go right for it to be good. And at $2, that's worth about, this is $2.30, but I'm going to say at $2, that's worth four cards, right? For 50 cents cards. That's too much for me for this value, if you ask me. I think I'd rather something else. It's not the worst, but I feel like we can do better. Looking at anything else at $1.50, I think the rest are fine. I don't think this is where I want to cut as much. Looking at sorceries, our top ones are Bubbling Muck to double our swamps for a turn. I'm going to lump this in with Dark Ritual, which is $1 more at $4, and say, I don't know if we need these cards. I do get that they are explosive and we can do some really, really cool things with them, namely some of our really powerful enchantments such as Oppression. We can use like Dark Ritual turn 1, slam out Oppression, and start to really frustrate our opponents. But that's such a narrow ability or a narrow pool we're drawing from. Our deck, because of the nature of a budget deck, can't really capitalize on this fast mana like a stronger deck would. And between the two of these cards, one being $3 and the other one being $4, if we add that together, $7, that's $14 worth of cards that we've put together. And I really don't think that these cards individually bring that much. And I'm going to say probably cut both. Bubbling Muck is a little better because it scales better later in game, where you might have 4 lands, you cast Bubbling Muck, you now have 6 mana. That's not too bad. Even further later in the game, you have 8 mana, you tap it, you now have 14 mana. Still very good. That being said, of course, it won't double things like Bojuka Bog, Scavenger Grounds, or Mortuary Mire, because they are not swamps or Gaia Reach, but still, I do like that ability. I would cut it, but I wouldn't hate you for playing it. Next on the list is Mutilate. I think Mutilate is fine here. I think very specifically it's important that... see, look at that price difference. Card Kingdom, $2.30. TCG Player at 50 cents. Perhaps it's the version of the card. I had to transfer this deck from Archetype. Is that the name of the... Archideck. Whatever, that other one, to Moxfield, because I prefer Moxfield, and maybe we missed the typage on some cards, but still, I do want to pick on these cards because no matter what version of this card, I think it's going to be about the same price. Yeah, I can see right here, it's about the same price. So Mutilate seems like a necessary evil. As Kermit was saying, this is a deck that gets ganged up on, and Mutilate can deal with that. I think we should keep Mutilate. I just wanted to speak on that for a second. I'm going to introduce a few other cards that do similar things, but Mutilate is going to be necessary, and I'd very much so like to keep it. After that, the next ones are like Night's Whisper, Rush of Dread. I think these are fine and great, and I'm happy to see them, so no problems there. In artifacts, we have the first really big one, which is Geth's Grimoire at $4.99. That's $5, so that's 10 cards worth. I have kind of a tough time here. I do think Get's Grimoire is very, very good, but I think this kind of draw engine does have its limits once again in this kind of power level of a deck. You need to be able to play Get's Grimoire and immediately get some discards out, which can be really good on turns where you already have things like Oppression out and other like Raider's Wake style effects where you're going to get discards done even though you're like without spending mana. And outside of that, I don't like it as much. I think it's kind of clunky. I think it needs the deck to be functioning, and when the deck is functioning, do you need to draw that many cards? Something that I think all players, including one of the notes that I had seen on this deck, we know that when you're playing discard deck, you've got a number of cards, Burglar Rat style, that get worse when your opponents are hellbent. When they're out of cards, all of a sudden a Burglar Rat doesn't do anything anymore, and you're paying 2 mana for a 1/1. So having a card that draws you cards at the point of the game where your opponents are probably hellbent anyways doesn't feel as great at this budget. If you can make it work by moving some things around for your personal version of the deck, I think it's a great inclusion. But this is taking up a lot of currency in the deck that can be used for something else, and in my mind might be worth on the chopping block. However, there are definitely better things to chop, which I'll get to in a second. Sol Ring is pretty close, I'm not gonna lie, at $2.30, and I can see in other versions, yeah, almost universally at least $2. It is hard to get Sol Ring under that, even though it's so ubiquitous with the format. I'm not saying cut it, but there is a universe that you do cut that card for that value. Felwar Stone, definitely cut. This is not worth $1.20. If we round that down to $1, that's still 2 cards worth for a card that only really helps you when someone has a swamp. Otherwise, you're using it basically like a Mind Stone, which is not half the price, but considerably less. If we round down, once again, it is half the price. So Felwar Stone is an easy cut. Sol Ring and Get's Grimoire, think about it a little bit, I would say. Going into enchantments, this is where I'm going to say the first card that, when it comes to price, no matter what, you should cut it, and it's Necrogen Mists. At this price here from Card Kingdom, this is $10, right? $9.49. We can round down to 9. But even when we look at TCG Player, it's still $9.41. So either way, it's $9. That's 18 cards worth in a $50 budget deck, and that's way too much for this effect. I don't know why this holds so much of a price value. I think it's just a lack of reprints. We can see this just mirrored it in a secret lair. I think, though clunkier, there are other ways to get this ability, some of which I will show in my editions. But I think this is just too much. Like, we're at a point that Liliana of the Veil can't be that much off. Liliana of the Veil is 14. Okay, it's still $5 more, so at least 30% more, but we're getting close to that point, right? Necrogen Mists is just too much of your deck's value for what it does, and I think easily cut it. And even if you did have the money for it in a $50 budget deck, I still would just rather it somewhere else. And Waste Not is a really good example of that. This is a $6 card. We can round down to $5.50 depending on exchange. TCG Player has it at $3. This is worth 12 cards, 100%. Waste Not solves a lot of problems that, in my opinion, something like Get's Grimoire does not. Get's Grimoire falls off because all it does is draw cards, and by the time you get to the point where you really want to do something with those cards, a lot of them are going to be useless, or you're going to need more mana to do them. But Waste Not solves the problem by generating bodies that can defend you, it generates mana to use on those cards, and it draws cards itself. So just in case you were wondering if I was going to ask to cut every single card after a certain price, I will not. I think that's pretty good. Likewise, Bottomless Pit and Phyrexian Arena I do like as well. Notice Bottomless Pit's ability is almost identical to Necrogen Mists, but Bottomless Pit is just, what, $4 less? that's 8 cards less of price. I think that's a huge difference, and I think it's absolutely worth keeping that over the other one. All right, before we go into editions, I'm going to check for a few cards that I think are still just not carrying their weight. Namely, I would say things like Mimic Vat. Mimic Vat is a card I used to play a lot when I was newer to the format, and I was never quite happy with it. And I'd have to ask the deck builder, is it really doing much for you? Like, don't get me wrong, I do understand that this can be good. It covers a base that Tiny Bones doesn't, so now you're exiling your opponent's creatures, but only one at a time, and once they're off of the Mimic Vat, they get it back in the graveyard. And then this is a mana sink because you need 3 mana. And like, yeah, that's still cute. You can put it under a Plague Crafter, a Burglar Rat. That's still nice. But is that enough? I don't know. I think it's a rather clumsy card, honestly. And yes, you can do some 3 mana, Fleshbag Marauder loops on it. But when your opponents see it coming constantly, they're going to play around it. They're going to work together to destroy the Mimic Vat. And you're not going to be really aggressively improving your board because you're spending so much mana to do this each turn. I'm kind of off of it. Maybe I'm being really rough on it. I do understand this is a very high ceiling card, but I feel like the floor isn't great, and I personally do not like that card, so maybe I'm just being mean to it. Looking at the rest, I think I'm generally happy with it. Arterial Flow, I think it's fine. Once again, mana cost to force each opponent to discard 2 cards is pretty good. I don't know if I wouldn't mind you playing like 1 or 2, Defile or other low mana destroy effects, but those tend to be a few dollars each, so might just not be in the means. You could probably get away with something like Disfigure, or I think recently there was another 1 black mana -2/2 cards. I think those are still pretty valuable, especially early game, to get some advantage. And then after that, you could be playing things like Doomblade and the like to kind of get the higher mana creatures, or higher toughness creatures as well, I should say. The rest of it looks really, really fine, so let's go right into additions. Now, this isn't a huge addition, but it was the first one that came to mind. I feel like the Raven Man is somewhat missing here. Something that's going to come back up near the end is this deck kind of does win through incidental damage. Now, there's nothing I've talked about before, specifically in red or aggressive decks, but it's the idea of understanding how damage is dealt by your deck, right? So some decks will do, the death by 1,000 cuts by constantly doing little pings of damage. Other decks will be hitting for like 6-7 damage off a creature regularly, and then some decks aim to do, hundreds of damage in one go. Now, this deck is very much so an example of the first one, right? There's a lot of incidental damage. People are losing 2 damage off of like a Megrim or Liliana's Caress or those kind of things. And then your creatures tend to be kind of low on power, so when they attack, they're attacking for 2-3 damage at a time. So traditionally, what I would say in something like this is you should diversify. I wouldn't mind a deck like this to have a few tall threats, that is to say creatures that have very, very high power, to make up for the fact of how the rest of the deck functions. However, due to our budget nature, that's a little trickier to do, and therefore I'm more interested in putting our budget towards what our deck does well. And so I want to do the same incidental damage, but I want to diversify how we do it. And the Raven Man is a really, really good example of this. This last ability always makes me laugh because it's the same ability as your commander, so you'll never use it. But that first ability that says each end step, if someone discarded, you get 1 Raven, right, creature. And this isn't much, but I would say this deck is just really, really good at easily triggering it, and getting a few bodies here and there isn't gonna hurt. I will note that this will be a combo with another card I suggest, or another 2 cards I suggest, and also the fact that the birds can't block doesn't really appeal to me, but I still wanted to point this out because I think it is a notable, what's the opposite of an inclusion? Exclusion, I guess. All right, moving on, we've got Gonti Night Minister. This really caught my eye as a card that's only about 40 cents according to this pricing here. And this is really interesting, right? Because this not only is good in the sense that it works with your commander's stash ability and generates mana as you do that first ability, but that second ability that allows you to steal cards as you attack your opponents is pretty cool, and it gives something for your burglar rats to do, because honestly those kind of creatures are usually 1/1s and not very strong. However, there is a third reason I wanted to add this, is that this is a soft incentivization for your opponents to attack each other. Being able to steal cards and cast them from each other is going to be something they're going to like to do, and if any of that stops them from attacking you, it's going to be powerful and make a difference. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they'll get fooled by it every time, but there's just going to be situations where they're going to take an extra 3 or 4 damage that would have gone your way that I think Gonti is going to help out. That's not even including the fact that Gonti's a 3/4, which will wall out a lot of smaller creatures that could be coming at you. So I think this is a pretty strong inclusion. After that, when it came to card advantage cards, I did want to mention Dark Tutelage. Especially in budget things, I really like Dark Tutelage. Now, once again, this is probably TCG Player that's listed at 6 cents. I don't know if you want to round that up to like 15 or something like that. This is once again a question about budget for whoever is playing the deck with their friends. However, still, Dark Tutelage is a particularly strong effect. It is a enchantment-based Dark Confidant that's harder to interact with as it is not a creature. Because of that, the ceiling on this card is really dependent on the rest of your deck, and your mana curve is built in a way that I think it's very much so worth the damage you're going to take. I am a big greatness at any cost kind of guy. If I'm drawing cards, I am happy. I really don't care how much life I'm paying for it, but you might not feel the same way, especially in a deck like this that doesn't have very many reliable life gain methods, so there is a cost to playing this card. However, at $50 budget, this is the closest you're going to get to a Dark Confidant effect, like comparing it to Necropotence or things like that. And even so, this is a cheaper Phyrexian Arena. Phyrexian Arena, if you remember, was like, I think $5, $4 or $5, whereas this is way less. So for those playing on a budget, this is absolutely a card you should be putting in. Another one, when I was thinking of Gonti, that came to mind is the Thieving Varmint. This is a really interesting card because black almost never gets these effects. Thieving Varmint is a 2/1 Death Touch lifelink. You tap it, pay a life, add 2 mana of any one color. Spend this mana only to cast spells you don't own. Now it's funny in this deck, the whole, tells you the color to put it in, even though the way you cast these spells is it doesn't matter what color you spend on it, so that line of text is kind of funny here. But if you think of it as a 2 mana Death Touch lifelinker that will tap for the mana for your stash cards, I think it's rather good. It also somewhat solves that problem I just brought up, that your opponents, that you might be paying life and you don't have ways to regain it. Lifelink on a creature like this ain't terrible, especially in situations where you haven't built up the stash and you just want to go swinging at some opponents for a little extra life. I think it's pretty solid. Late game, its Death Touch ability is going to be very good in order to do some blocking, but, this is a pretty big but, because of how your commander works, you probably won't have that opportunity, right? Your commander only lets you cast those cards on your turn, so Thieving Varmint will tend to be tapped because you have used it as a soul ring to cast spells out of your stash. So most oftentimes it won't be able to block. Still worth considering, and I would say a 2 mana creature that acts as a soul ring for 1 life is pretty good. Coming back to the idea of Necrogen Mists, I wanted to compare it to Necrogoyf. So Necrogoyf is an interesting card. It is 5 mana to cast, but 3 mana with Madness, which is very reasonable with certain effects in your deck. However, even if not, it is a 5 mana card that just has Necrogen Mists text on it. However, in addition, it gets to attack. Necrogoyf is equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards, and though your commander is exiling those creatures out of play, that's not going to exile every creature, and therefore in Necrogoyf, I think reasonably will be 4 power or higher, assuming, each player has lost 1 creature. That makes it a pretty good attacker, that makes it a pretty good blocker, and once again, it will just feed itself when your commander's not in play with that second ability. Though I will say, I guess you could just discard your own creatures. They don't get exiled and Necrogoyf will grow. Even then, I think the value of this card is rather strong, and just the difference in price, right? This, according to here, you can pick up for like 15 cents. You could round that up to 25 cents depending on where you get it, and it'll do such a good impression of Necrogen Mists that you won't mind the difference at all. On the other hand, I wanted to look at a few more cards that would have Megrim or Liliana Caresses or the Rack style effects. Wheel of Torture caught my eye. This is the Rack for each opponent, where, you just take whatever cards, as long as they have 2 or less cards. Yeah, as long as they have 2 or less cards, they'll start taking damage, and when they're held up, they'll take 3 damage, which is a bolt to the face at every one of their upkeeps. And this kind of effect is hard to find at this budget level, so I do like this as an additional way for the deck to function. It does really put the clock on your opponents and will increase pressure, but what can you do? Games do have to end. Likewise, same text here, Davril does a very good impression as well. However, of course, Davril's text is a little different, whereas this will do only 2 damage ever, and will never do 3, but triggers when they have 1 or fewer. Still pretty good. That -1 can still pick off a few extra cards here and there, and at, once again, 30 cents, 18 cents, it's going to be very easy to pick up for this budget. Another one, once again, same kind of text, Invasion Eldraine. Of course, this one's a little trickier because it is a discard 2 on 1 opponent, and then it comes in as a siege. I don't know how easy it is for you to break that siege, but you'll have to figure out. However, when you break the siege, of course, Prickle Fairies does a very good impression of, once again, these kind of rack effects. This one triggers, though, on 2 or fewer, and once again always deals 2 damage, which is pretty good because usually at 2 or fewer, they'll take 1 damage. At 2 cards, they'll take 1 damage, so this doing double that is nice. And a 2/2 flyer is a pretty good body, once again, at this power level and this budget, especially because the deck has no real flyers otherwise. So, something worth considering. It's a little clunky, but I did want to mention it nonetheless. Next, Village Rites here is as kind of a stand-in for all the cards that do this same effect. I think Corrupted Conscience is another one. I might be wrong, maybe that's the blue card, but there's another one with a Johnny on it that has the same text, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. And I wanted to mention like this and that probably as inclusions because there's going to be a lot of situations I feel you'll be left with Burglar Rats and nothing to do with them, especially at the point that your opponents are all hellbent, and having just the means of turning them into cards is pretty good. Of course, these are nombos with like your Plaguecrafter effects, because if you sacrifice the Plaguecrafter to Village Rites, you still have to sacrifice a creature, and if you have other creatures such as Tiny Bones, that's not going to feel very good. But otherwise, I think you're pretty happy with this card. If you play Burglar Rat, right? Your opponents all discard a card. You spent 1 card, they lose 3 cards. You just got a 3 for 1. And then Burglar Rat just blocks anything and then is sacrificed to Village Rites. Then you've spent 2 cards. Your opponents are down 3 cards. You're up 2 cards. It's a pretty good situation, I would say. And that can help refill your hand mid, late game, and just is a pretty good top deck as long as you have creatures, which this deck can, it can get away with. This is not even including the fact that, you can cast your opponent's creatures from the stash and then Village Rites them when you're done with them. And though, yes, you still spent the mana, like it's just not a card from your hand. You're sacrificing a card from exile, so you are up more. These are like percentage point wins, but I think they're pretty important wins in the long run in games like this. Budget, when you play big budget like Commander games, you'll learn that games can stall really easily because board clears and like really swinging abilities are out of budget most of the time. So having something that can just get you ahead during a board stall like Village Rites can be rather good. Now I want to talk about board clears. There were a few cards I wanted to mention. Barter in Blood, and after that, Taste of Death are cards that I wanted to bring up as really kind of cool ways around the cost of board clears. Now these ones are very specifically, each player sacrifices X creatures. Barter in Blood is 2, Taste in Death is 3, and I'm going to suggest that on a lot of boards, that's enough to, you know, be a board clear. Now I know we're already playing Rankle's Prank, which is Barter in Blood at least, I believe, among other abilities, but it doesn't mean you might not want to run another copy of this, or Barter in Blood is cheaper, and Taste of Death, of course, is just a further version of that. This one also creates food tokens, which is nice for life gain, but otherwise irrelevant. What's more important is that these are really high value removal spells in Commander. If you consider Taste of Death, especially if you have like one or no creatures and your opponents have several creatures each, this is an incredibly big swing in your direction, and traditionally the reason why board clears are so strong. It's not always going to work, but when it works, it's going to be particularly good and can be a nice safety valve when the pressure's too high for you. But you might be saying, but Curse, my opponents are really into tokens. What am I going to do about that? Because cards like Barter in Blood, Taste in Death are really, really bad against tokens. Well, I'm going to suggest cards like Illness in the Ranks and Virulent Plague. Why? Well, I feel like this deck is already very, very weak to tokens, especially token generation cards that are hard for this deck to interact with, like things that go on the battlefield, things that are enchantments, and that if just left alone will generate a token turn after turn. Well, I think this deck is rather weak to that because your main methods of interacting will just not interact, especially if they're enchantments. But Virulent Plague and Illness in the Ranks solve that problem permanently. Both of them are really, really good against creature tokens, and if Illness in the Rank doesn't necessarily kill them, Virulent Plague will, and if you don't play the Plague and just Illness, -1/-1 can still make a huge difference. If your opponents have 6 2/2s and now they're 6 1/1s, that's a huge, huge difference in the amount of damage you'll be taking, and the amount of reasonable blocks you can do. Remember that, you know, Tiny Bones is a 1/3, which means against 1/1s, he can kill them, against 2/2s he can block them, so making a 3/3 a 2/2 is still something. So I think those cards are really, really good. They are kind of narrow. If your opponents aren't dealing with any, like using any tokens, creature tokens, you're not really getting the most out of them, or anything out of them, I should say. But that doesn't mean they're not good. That doesn't mean you still don't want to play them. I will note, of course, this is the Nombo I was talking about with the Raven Man. These cards are universal, right? All these effects do affect your creature tokens, so you're disincentivized to play creature tokens when you run these. And as the deck is now, there are no creature tokens, so keep that in mind. I still think they're really, really strong and pretty surprising for opponents who are not prepared for them. The last two are going to be mixes of these last two types of cards where you're trying to deal with board clears and you're trying to deal with tokens. And these are two Pestilence style cards. We've got Pestilence proper, and then for much more mana, we've got Pestilence Demon, an old favorite of mine. This flavor text goes hard and speaks to me deeply. These two cards have the text Pestilence. This deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. Of course, they function a little differently. Pestilence will not function if there are no creatures and gets sacrificed at the end of the turn. And Pestilence Demon, of course, can destroy itself through damage, its own damage, so not particularly great. It is a 6/7 though, which is, a 7/6, which is incredibly impressive. And so there is another upside to these, but both of these cards are going to be particularly good at putting your opponents into a situation they can't fight out of. Namely, I'd like to point out that even the small difference of Tiny Bones being a 1/3 means that with either of these Pestilence effects, anything with 2 toughness or less just cannot survive, because you can just constantly put 2 black mana in and then ping them all out, keep Tiny Bones, and move on. I played a Pauper deck around Pestilence, and I still have it somewhere friend of mine is putting together a Pauper tournament. I should bring that. I don't know if it's still good enough. I'm sure the Pauper meta is very, very strong now, but Pestilence is very, very strong and makes a huge difference in boards and lets you control them. That's not even including coming back to kind of where we started, where we were talking about incidental damage, right? Pestilence and Pestilence Demon both represent so much incidental damage. At any point, whatever black mana you have open is that much damage you could be doing to your opponents. And that's really, really good in a deck that's just trying to make the most of a little damage here, a little damage there. Your opponents are all under like 15. Play Pestilence, tap out on your last opponent's end step to do 8 damage, comes back to you, tap out again, game's over. And I think that's really, really strong and an easy inclusion that, like, at worst case scenario, this can just also be used to just board wipe by doing 6 damage across the board. All the creatures are dead, you lose your commander, it's fine, you just move on. I would say the ceilings on these cards are rather high, and the floor is pretty good too. And with that, that's everything I have to say about Tinybone's Bauble Burglar. Thank you so much for sending the deck. I hope this was helpful. I really do like budget decks, and they bring like a different thought pattern to kind of build, and I really do like that. We're not just sitting around saying, oh, you need to play Dark Confidant, oh, you need to play this other like very common black card, oh, you need to play Necropotence, because we can't, which is really fun and lets us build in interesting ways. So I hope this deck does well. I hope these additions helped, and good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.